I got started making igniters when I figured out that for our TARC teams, igniters were costing our team about $3 a piece, and the students weren't putting them in properly, and so we'd go through 3 or 4 igniters trying to get a rocket up. So funds being what they were, it was time to come up with a technique to make my own and stuff. So I went onto the internet and found a couple of places and found some good suggestions on how to make igniters, and I kind of morphed them into a best practice for the way that I do it. And so the first thing was getting the ingredients that I needed for the basically the pyrogen, and so I went online and I settled on potassium nitrate and charcoal. Okay, so you can get the potassium nitrate from eBay. I mean, it's really cheap, 4 or 5 pounds for about 12 bucks, and you don't need any hazmat shipping or anything like that, so that worked out very well. And you can go down to Home Depot and get the natural charcoal briquettes, and they look something like that. And you put them in a coffee grinder. You can get them ground down in pretty fine powder, enough to get you started so that you can mix the remainder in with a mortar and pestle. You need some nichrome wire, and so I settled on using I started off with some 32 gauge nichrome wire that seemed to work the best, and settled on about 2 inches as the optimum length, simply from a handling standpoint. And the launching system I had no issue heating up, somewhat less than a 2-inch length of nichrome wire. I did experiment around a little bit with some 40 gauge wire, really difficult to handle, but I ended up making a few igniters for that, and then I even made some electric matches, and they work really good for setting them off with a 9-volt battery. So, but it's a little difficult to work with. And the actual wire itself, the lead wire is I settled on some 26 gauge wire wrap wire with its Kynar insulation. And the Kynar insulation is good because when you solder the bridge wire to the lead wire, the insulation doesn't melt and pull away like a PVC insulation does, and the Kynar insulation is nice and thin. So you needed something thin to get into the motors that we were using, and we are pretty much targeting E's and F size motors for these igniters. So then now I have the powder and I got the wires and stuff, and I needed a binder to basically glue the pyrogen to the bridge wire. And so you can make that easy enough by taking some ping pong balls, putting them in a little bit of acetone. They melt up, and you'll get a consistency of say like Elmer's glue or so, and basically what you got is nitrocellulose, and it works pretty good. And you leave it in a jar long enough, and it gets all the acetone evaporates off. You just have to throw some more acetone on there, and it rejuvenates itself. Then the last piece of the puzzle was really soldering the nichrome wire to the lead wire. And so the only peculiar thing about that is the flux that you need. You can go down, and it's basically the same flux I use for soldering copper pipe. It has to have zinc chloride in there. Nichrome wire doesn't solder very well. It's really hard to solder, so you need a good flux to make it solder. So those basically are the main ingredients, and I'll talk about some of the other things I tried a little bit later on. So then the tools that I ended up needing to make this stuff, I used a scale to measure out potassium nitrate and charcoal. Basically, your everything's done by weight. I needed a mortar and pestle to grind the stuff, a coffee grinder to get my charcoal down to a manageable size, soldering iron, wire cutters, wire strippers, tweezers. Tweezers were really important when you started working with the nichrome wire because it's difficult to handle. And you can see my glassware is really specialized, some old baby food jars that we had left over, some stirring sticks. A holding fixture, you'll need a little, to make yourself a little fixture to, when you're soldering the wires together. So you can just basically set your igniter inside the fixture in here, and it'll hold it for you while you do your soldering and stuff. Just a paper clip on a chunk of wood worked really good for me. And a power drill with a bent nail adapter for twisting the leads together, and basically some pliers. So nothing out of the ordinary. So the step-by-step approach I used is, first I made my super sauce by cutting up the ping pong balls and adding the acetone to the jar and letting it dissolve. And then you want to get that to, basically you're going to have to play around with it, adding ping pong balls and acetone until you get it, a little bit less viscous than white glue. And mention it. This stuff pretty hazardous stuff. It gives off a lot of fumes, so use in a well ventilated area, and it's flammable. Keep your soldering and stuff away from it and stuff, so you don't start yourself on fire. So then to make the pyrogen itself, I basically took potassium nitrate, 80% by weight, to charcoal, 20% by weight, and mixed it together, and then ground it up as fine as I could using a mortar and pestle. I tried using a ball mill a couple of weeks ago, and that works really well. Make sure you use like non-spark producing material inside for grinding it up. I went down to the toy store and got some marbles and stuck some flint glass marbles in there. Worked great. So I stuck it in the ball mill for 4 days, and I got some really nice fine powdered pyrogen material. And you can see this will last virtually forever. That much powder will last virtually forever. So just make certain that you store it in a good tight container, because it is pretty hazardous material. First operation for the mechanical operation basically involves taking your Kynar wire, and I started off for the igniters I was making. I started off with a 12-inch piece of wire, and then I would strip about 3 millimeters off the end, off each end, and I would fold it in half. And then you take the 2-inch piece of your 32 gauge nichrome wire, and you basically got to hold it with your fingers very carefully and wrap it around it. And I use the rule of, for my application, 5. So I got 5 turns on the bare wire. I folded I actually put 5 turns on the bare wire. I put it in my little fixture here and soldered it, and then folded over, and I wrapped 5 turns of wire loosely wrapped around the blue insulation, and then 5 turns around the upper piece for the to complete the circuit, and then soldered it. So then I basically had I had my loop like this. It wasn't twisted at this point, but I had my loop like this, and there was no pyrogen on it. And then I would grab it by with my pliers, stick the bent nail in here, and use my drill and twisted it, and that's how I twisted it together. So it's not terribly important how many twists per inch you get. You just want to get it twisted. Now it's important, very important, that you hold this end real tight with the pliers, because it will unravel all the good work you did trying to get that thing wrapped. So once you get it to that stage, then you can dip the assembly into the pyrogen, and depending upon how much or how thick your pyrogen is will determine how many times you have to dip it. Now, the first couple of passes I made with it, I made the mixture a little bit too thick, and when I pulled it up, you'd have a big glob sitting on the end, and you couldn't push it through the throat of the rocket motor. So You have to, add some more acetone to it. It'll thin it down, dip it in there, and it should just drip off the end. And if you have to dip it twice, so be it. It's pretty simple. So you dip it, you'll get a igniter that pretty much looks like the commercial igniters that you buy. In fact, you can control the amount of pyrogen you put on it, and if for the bigger motors, you can make a thicker bulb of pyrogen on the end. For the thinner motors, the E's and stuff, a little thinner. Now, one of the problems I had working with the particular pyrogen is it has to be, for the motors to light, you have to have a good hot burn. And if you remember the formula for gunpowder, it had, potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur. Well, the sulfur, it was in there only to make it easier to ignite. When you put the sulfur in there, it burns about 150 to 200 degrees cooler than if you leave the sulfur out. So that's why there's no sulfur in there. And the ignition wire on there is more than ample enough to get it started up. When you start getting into the red strontium-based, motors, they're a lot harder to light than the nice white lightnings and such like that. So I actually cracked open a firecracker or two and poured the powder in there, and that seemed to get it nice and hot, and it worked pretty good. I've since then just purchased some aluminum powder because that was the agent that was getting it hot, and you can stick aluminum powder in there. But it burns a little faster too, so you got to be careful how you do it.
So you just dip it once with the...
Yeah, I just dip it once. Now, if your sauce is a little bit too thin, you won't get enough pyrogen on there. So you have to play around with the thickness, or dip it multiple times, and it'll keep building up each time. So, and this works pretty good for the D's and E's and F's and G's and such. If you want to get into the higher power stuff, and you got to get a lot more pyrogen on there, and you can actually, I got a couple that I've tried that I haven't actually stuck in a rocket yet, but you end up taking a soda straw and you put it around the lead wire and the bridge wire, and then just pack it full, and then you'll get a lot of pyrogen in there and won't have any problem starting it. You just have to adjust the length of your lead to accommodate the motor that you're going to be launching with. So, during halftime of a football game, you can sit down and make yourself at least 10 or 20 igniters, no problem at all. Works pretty good.